And it's time for the next guest, Gregory Kohn. We will talk the contingent animal, why behavioral development still doesn't meet innateness. Gregory did his PhD at Indiana University, Bloomington, under the supervision of Meredith West, and he's now a group leader at University of North Florida, studying the way animals construct their social environment and the feedback loops between this environment and their development. He's also interested in behavioral development and developmental systems theory. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation and being with us here. And you can start the talk. Oh, we can see the screen. We can hear you actually.
Okay, sorry about that. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So thanks for inviting me to this talk and the symposium. Like I said, my name is Gregory Kohn. I'm an assistant professor of psychology at the University of North Florida. And I'm also a professor in residence and researcher at the Jacksonville Zoo and Gardens here in Jacksonville, Florida. And this is going to be quite a different talk than I'm used to giving. I'm used to giving talks on my empirical research, but this is going to be a talk on some of the theoretical ideas I've had over the past 10 years about the role of innateness in explaining behavioral development. And so one of the reasons I'm so interested in questions of innateness is because my research focuses on avian social development. And in particular, I focus on the juvenile period in birds. And this is when birds are becoming independent of their parents, and they're starting to transition into the larger group. They're starting to navigate interactions with unfamiliar individuals and learn to behave like members typical of their species. But for a long period of time, during research on the juvenile period was understudied. And the reason it was understudied was because, in large part, a lot of researchers assumed that avian social behavior was innate. That meant at conception, birds inherited a genetic predisposition that allowed them to recognize members of their own species and also have the knowledge about how to interact with them. So I've always been really interested and tuned into questions of nature versus nature, questions of innate versus acquired. But one of the things I've found, which resonates in some of the previous talks we've had in the symposium, is that if you actually go and ask researchers, walk into a psychology department, or you walk into a biology department, ask them, hey, is the phenomenon you study nature or nurture? They'll usually have a pretty nuanced response. They'll say, well, maybe a little bit of both, or maybe it's an interaction, or maybe they'll say that the dichotomy doesn't make much sense. However, as said by Susan Yama, it seems like once in a generation, this dichotomy always undergoes a reinvention. And it seems like the most recent reinvention of this dichotomy is within the domain of artificial intelligence. So here there is a debate between the performance of two different algorithmic approaches. The first one is artificial neural networks, especially unsupervised artificial neural networks, and what is called good old-fashioned symbolic AI approaches, which is represented by this flowchart down there. And so in artificial neural networks, their performance is based upon the statistical properties of the input variables that shape the distribution of signal across a neural network, ultimately creating usable outputs. In contrast to this, good old-fashioned AI approaches come with fixed delineated instructions tailored to specific outputs. So, and it's the debate between the merits of these two approaches has really set the stage for reinvigorating and reconceptualizing the concept of innateness in the 21st century. So although this debate is pretty far outside my specific domain of animal behavior, I think it can be summed up like this. Artificial neural networks, especially unsupervised artificial neural networks, but even supervised ones as well, require massive amounts of training data. You have to feed these algorithms a lot of pictures of cats or horses in order for them to learn what a difference between a cat and a horse is. In contrast to this, good old-fashioned AI approaches come out of the box with an already appropriate response. So while debating the merits of these two approaches, researchers like Gary Marcus have gone outside the domain of artificial intelligence to look at the behavior of animals as a guide. And what do they find? Well, what they find is something like this. So this is a wood duck. And this wood duck that's the wood duck's nest, and that's her offspring who's sitting on the nest. And the wood duck wants her offspring to get off the nest and come join her in the water. So what she does is she gives this maternal contact call. Now, this is the first time that her offspring have heard this maternal contact call. So in response to this, they jump up 1 foot to the end of the nest and then take a leap. And these nests are sometimes 30 feet up in the air. So these small ducklings are jumping 30 feet into the water below, hitting the water, and then making a beeline to their mother in order to form a very strong relationship with her for the first few weeks of their life. So this is the wood duck's imprinting response. And so when you're looking at the behavior of animals, you're going to see that many animals show appropriate responses to novel stimuli the first time they encounter them. And there's not a lot of opportunities for training or learning, it is assumed, in these responses. And so therefore, it is assumed that these behaviors represent innate programs that are fixed, and that they are independent of specific causal experiences, and that they're pre-functional. So what we mean by independent of specific causal experiences is you can take that wood duckling and you can raise it in a bakery, you can raise it in a lab, you can raise it in many different contexts. And as long as you give it access to that stimuli, the mother contact call, it's going to respond in a predictable way. And what we mean by pre-functional is that the biological organization for these traits develops prior to their function. And because of the existence of behaviors that look like this, the proponents of good old-fashioned AI often assume that they have natural history on their side, that the ethological evidence from animal behavior supports the notion that animals come into this world with pre-specified instructions to cope with very specific stimuli in the environment. And this can be seen most directly in a paper by Tony Zader in 2019, where he directly compares the supposedly innate behavior of animals during early development with the performance of good old-fashioned AI in contrast to artificial neural network approaches. And so this idea doesn't seem that unfamiliar to me as somebody who works in animal behavior at all. The founders of classical ethology, such as Nico Tinbergen and Konrad Lorenz, proposed an almost identical idea at the very beginning of our science. And so I want to go through just a cartoon version of what their model of innateness looks like, and to show it really does share a lot of similarities with the good old-fashioned AI approach. So here is a young cartoon of a young herring gull chick. And this young herring gull chick has been hatched for only a few hours, and it is bombarded with visual stimuli from the outside world. But there's only one specific stimuli in its environment that acts as a releaser. And the visual stimuli from that releaser enters into the animal's sensory system and activates an innate releasing mechanism that contains the instructions for a specific behavior that is then sent to the muscles in order to result in a fixed action pattern. And so a lot of people will say, okay, well, where does this innate releasing mechanism come from? Well, it's been postulated by many researchers, both historically and contemporaneously, that at conceptions, individuals inherit a genetic program that is programmed in the sequence of their genome that allows their brain to have certain neural circuitries that allows them to have these innate releasing mechanisms. So along with containing an explanation for why animals behave, have these complex behaviors during early life, this also contains within it a theory of development, which I call and others call the nativist approach to development. And in the nativist approach to development, it's not that the environment isn't useful. It's the environment is only supportive. It allows the organism to survive and become a healthy individual, but there's no specific features of the environment that are specifically causal. And this is the logic between a lot of tests that people use in developmental psychology, such as the Common Garden experiments, twin studies, seeks to place individuals in different environments to see if they will show the same behavior. And the idea is that if they do, these behaviors represent a predetermined unfolding of genetic programs in a healthy organism, and that those behaviors can ultimately be reduced to innate behavior in the organism's brain. So this native approach to development comes from a very specific tradition from which developmental questions were asked in the history of both developmental psychology, comparative psychology, and to a limited extent in developmental psychobiology. And so what I want to look at here, this is a timeline of a brown-headed cowbird's life. We'll be talking more about those birds in a little bit. This bulb right here, that is conception, and we're moving all the way to an individual's death at the end of their life. So as a researcher, you have to make an observation somewhere along this individual's timeline. So I'm going to choose the juvenile timeline because that's where I usually begin my investigations. And then if you're interested in asking developmental questions, you're faced with a choice. And traditionally, the way developmental questions were answered was by taking a retroactive view, where you look back in time towards an individual's early life, and you try to identify and control for specific developmental precursors. These are experiences that might cause the behavior of interest. And usually this was done through isolation studies, where you take an organism and you isolate them from certain experiences, and if they still showed those behaviors, you would assume that they were innate. So this isn't showing any positive evidence of genetic programs or developmental programs, but it is assuming innateness via removing potential confounding factors. In contrast to this, there's another way of looking at developmental questions, which is the prospective view. And the prospective view investigates how current phenotypes provide the causal foundation for later phenotypes. And the advantage of the prospective view is it makes no assumptions of innateness, because you can't really answer questions of where this behavior comes from if you don't have observations starting at the very beginning of development. So there are some severe problems with the retroactive view of development. And these were first highlighted by Danny Lehrman in his classic critique that was brought up in the introduction of Konrad Lorenz's theory of innate behavior. And the first is that it assumes that we, as researchers, have a priori knowledge of which experiences are causal. And we can see from the last talk we just listened to that our own intuitions of what might be causing development are not always, as accurate as we suppose. And within this, it also assumes that the causal experiences will have some similarities with the behavior of interest. And so in the instances where the retroactive view works really well is where we see obvious developmental precursors to specific outcomes. So let's look at this grasshopper sparrow here. Let's say you're never familiar with grasshopper sparrows. You don't know really much about them, but you look at their song, which is represented right here by a sonogram. A sonogram is a visual representation of song that is used a lot within birdsong research. And you might ask, what might be the obvious developmental precursor to this grasshopper sparrow having this specific song? And if you look earlier in development, you might find instances where that individual was exposed to that song from other individuals. And so therefore there is an obvious developmental precursor in this, and therefore it is not innate. However, where the retroactive view kind of falls apart is when we have non-obvious influences in developmental systems. So you could hypothesize that, for instance, experiences in the egg, such as how the egg constrains the development of the syrinx, or vibrations from other individuals. These prenatal influences, which are not obviously connected to the structure of the song, might hypothetically have very specific causal influences that ultimately result in this grasshopper sparrow singing that particular song. And thanks to developmental psychobiologists and their investigations over the years, we have a lot of instances of these non-obvious experiences in the development of species typical behaviors. For instance, chicks require some of the nutrients they get through eating insects, and in many farms, the insects that they get is mealworms. And Wallman conducted a famous study in 1970 where he first observed that very early in development, young chicks spend a lot of time right after they hatch pecking at their own toes. And so he thought, well, what is the developmental reason for why chicks may spend so much time pecking at their toes? And what he found is he was able to put these cute little booties on the chicks' feet and found that chicks who had the booties on their feet, who weren't able to get the visual stimulation from their own feet, weren't able to learn to pick up and eat mealworms, and that there was a critical period in this. So if you put boots on their feet for a long period of time, they never got the ability to pick up and eat mealworms. So here was a very specific experience. The ability to interact with your own toes had a non-obvious influence on your ability to eat mealworms. We also have examples from the primate literature about this. For instance, in rhesus macaques and in spider monkeys, some studies have shown that experiences with insects, especially biting insects, is absolutely necessary for the development of fear of snakes. So without that experience, they don't develop these abilities. But what I want to do right now is return back to that example that I talked about at the beginning of this study. I talked about how those wood ducklings would just hop out of the nest and they would just follow their mother's contact call. Well, the ability for wood duck nestlings to recognize their maternal contact call over other contact calls from other individuals and other species has a non-obvious source of developmental experience as well. And this comes from interactions as an embryo inside the egg. So the embryo that is sitting in the egg is interacting with its environment, and specifically it's interacting with its neighboring siblings in their eggs. And their neighboring siblings are making vocalizations. And even though these vocalizations look nothing like the maternal contact call, individuals need to experience those vocalizations in order for, after they hatch out of the egg, to recognize that as a wood duck call, and I should follow that, over following playbacks of another call, such as a chicken. So hearing your own sibling vocalize is a necessary and non-obvious precursor for recognizing later maternal contact calls. But what about other species? There are species, for instance, like mallard ducklings, that has shown that even experience with your own body is essential for the development of very specific behaviors. Gilbert Gottlieb did this work in his farm in Dorothea Dix Hospital, where he showed that the heart rate of ducks pressed against their syrinx and caused those ducks to make noises. But if you put a little bit of crazy glue on their syrinx, which is their voice box, these young ducklings were not able to make vocalizations. And as an embryo, hearing your own vocalizations, even though they don't reflect the acoustic properties of a maternal contact call, were necessary and specific experiences needed to recognize that contact call. And that individuals who were devocalized in the egg were otherwise healthy when they hatched. There was no behavioral issues with them whatsoever, but they failed to be able to distinguish between a duck contact call and a chicken contact call. So you might say, well, you're talking about ducks and maybe ducks are special. How does this have relevance to our broader understanding of innately? But let's say we could identify a species that, by all logic of evolutionary theory, should have an innate safety net. And then we can look at the development of that species to see whether experiences do play a role in the development of these behaviors. And that species is the brown-headed cowbird. And so you might ask, why is the brown-headed cowbird a really good species to study innateness from? Well, the brown-headed cowbird is an obligate brood parasite. This means that a female cowbird never raises her own offspring. The female goes into the nests of other species. Indeed, 200 other species have been documented and lays her eggs in those species' nests. And because of the lack of consistent early experiences that this affords, researchers, evolutionary biologists such as Ernst Marr and others, have assumed that all of the cowbird's reproductive behavior and social behavior is innate. It is determined at conception. So there, however, research done by Meredith West, Andrew King, and their graduate student Todd Freeberg showed that this isn't the case. They took juvenile male cowbirds and they raised them with canaries for the first year of their life. So they didn't have access to females of their own species. Then when individuals were 1 year of age, and sexually mature, they moved them into another aviary where they had access to both canaries and females of their own species. And these females of their own species would land right next to these cowbirds and basically say, mate with me right here, and the males wanted nothing to do with them. And instead went around trying to court and mate with these completely bewildered, traumatized canaries. So we know that social interaction, even in a species where you would expect selection to have selected for a really strong innate safety net, needs some social interactions in order to develop species typical behavior. And we also know in cowbirds, like in the other examples, that non-obvious interactions are essential for their behavior and development. So there's been a theory within a lot of birdsong that birds do learn their song from other individuals, but there's researchers saying that in their mind is an innate representation, a template of the song, and that template guides their learning towards some species typical elements. However, Meredith West and Andrew King have shown that there are non-obvious influences that also guide a cowbird's attention towards a species typical song. So this is a video, stills from a video recording in a sound attenuation chamber of brown-headed cowbirds. And this is a male here. And this male has basically been babbling at this female for an hour. He's just been singing like kind of nonsense songs. And the female has just been sitting there, not doing anything. And then, just by chance, he hits upon a song variant that that female prefers. And the female does something like this. She raises her wing ever so slightly, and the male levitates off the perch, rushes in. He finds this so reinforcing. So we know that males who are exposed to more wing strokes sing better quality song and have better, higher reproductive success as adults. And this research was recently also replicated within zebra finches, who are like the lab mice in the ornithological world. And just like cowbirds are seen to have a template that guides their song development, the same thing has been said for zebra finches as well. However, there was something that was found in zebra finches that was really interesting. So young zebra finches learn their song from attending to their father's song. Their mothers, who do not sing, when they are in the family group, individuals learn to copy their father better than when they're housed with their father alone. And research done by Samantha Caruso-Peck and Mike Goldstein at Cornell University found that when young zebra finches sing a good match to their father, their mother responds with this fluff up display and wing stroke. And they showed in this diagram that you can see right here that you can use video recordings of this fluff up display contingently to reinforce high matches to the father, resulting in species typical song. But when this is absent, you don't get a very good match to the father's song, showing that female finches who do not sing and are therefore a non-obvious source of song development guide the development of species typical endpoints. So what I want you to get here is that experiences are specifically causal for the development of species typical behavior, that all species need specific experiences in order to have a behavior, and that you can't necessarily just always abstract an organism out of its environment and place it in other contexts, because we often don't have access to which experiences are specifically causal, and we need a prospective view of development in order to discover those. But you might say, well, wait a second, what about genes? At the very beginning, you said that a lot of people think that the genetic sequence that you inherit from your parents contains the necessary instructions for the development of this innate program. So before we do that, I want to think about a hypothetical example. Let's say we had a hypothetical pluripotent stem cell machine that was able to take the DNA of any organism and supplied with enough amino acids and other compounds, just simply read off the animal's genome. If you were able to do this, what would you get? Well, even if you ran this machine for hundreds of years, you wouldn't get something that looks like an organism. You would get something that looks like a protein shake. So we know that genes do not have the informational capacity to encode or independently cause complex features. That's why there's so much research now in looking at compression of genetic information by people in bioinformatics. But that's fine, because you do not just inherit genes from your parents. You inherit your parents' cell with all of those cytoplasmic factors. You inherit aspects of your parents' environment, including their social environment. And so from a developmental point of view, genes do not occupy a privileged causal role. And some of the studies that are showing that really well are these studies with what are known as cross-species clones. So here's an example of a cross-species clone where you can take the genome of one species. In this case, we have this species right here of a goldfish, and you can take the denucleated egg, meaning an egg without any DNA in it, of a common carp right here, And you can raise that egg in the common carp, and you can look at what the resulting phenotype looks like. And what we get is something that does have some goldfish features, but overall looks a lot more like the egg donor than the genome donor. And this shows that extragenomic influences can really canalize species-typical endpoints. So you might say, okay, that's great, but we know that the genome that you inherit is not going to change based on your life experiences. No matter what you do in your life, you're not going to change the underlying genetic makeup that you inherited from your parents. And that's largely true. However, it's also been shown through a large range of studies that I won't be going into now, but I'll post a book in a second that you can look into this further, that you can take lists of genotypes, clonal individuals, and through different developmental processes produce a wide range of phenotypes. In contrast, you can also take a wide range of genotypes and through developmental process canalize their development so they all show the same phenotypes. And the mechanism that's causing this is different experiences between an organism and its environment. And if you want to read more about this, I highly recommend David Moore's books, especially The Dependent Gene. And so what I hope you got here from this talk is that when we talk about behavioral development, experience is absolutely essential to the development of even very species-typical abilities. However, those experiences can be non-obvious, and the statistical properties of the input or the experiences that we have don't necessarily have to have a linear or even predictable role in the development of species-typical behaviors for them to be specifically causal. And because of this, I don't really see a clear computational or algorithmic analog to the development of behaviors, either within artificial neural networks or within good old-fashioned AI approaches. And it is not clear to me, as somebody who studies animal behavior, whether the behavior of animals should be used as a good starting point for inspiring these different artificial systems, or, and I'm even more concerned about this, if these artificial systems fade into shaping our own perceptions of how we view developmental processes. So what is another way that we can look at the development of systems? So we know that the environment changes the organism. Every time you interact with the environment, it changes your underlying biology in sometimes a non-trivial way. And that those internal changes in our biologies, in turn, change how we interact with the environment. And I think by acknowledging these two very basic points, we have a really good model of development that does not depend on innateness. And here, development is simply changes in an organism-environment relationship over time, and documenting how these patterns change causally within the life history of an individual. And so my recommendation for as we move forward with developmental studies is to focus less on identifying, on using metaphors such as programs, which look like explanations for development, but they're really black box terms that hide our ignorance of developmental processes. And to look forward, start at a behavior of interest and look forward in development. Describe patterns of relationship between an organism and environment, and then use experimental or other approaches to understand how these patterns at time point A can transfer into patterns at time point B. So I want to thank my lab who's, tolerated my rants about issues of innateness. I don't really know if they agree with me or not, but they tolerate them nonetheless, and my advisors, Meredith West and Andrew King. And everybody, thanks for listening. And if you have any questions, and of course, my funding agencies who I would not be able to do my empirical work that at all. So thank you.
Thank you very much for an amazing talk. And yes, we have time for questions. And there's a question from Shaba Ondal that it's about the ducklings. If the duckling would have a developmental defect which would prevent it from following the visual or other cues from its mother, would it still feel the innate, no, it's not innate, urge to jump off? So basically, are there other maybe influence included in there?
So yeah, so one of the reasons I guess one of the reasons why, so wood ducklings, if you raise them in an incubator and raise them alone where they don't have access to their siblings, do not develop the ability to feel the urge to jump off things and follow the maternal contact call. They actually are fairly stationary. And that was known for quite some time before Gilbert Gottlieb studied the wood ducks in his laboratory. And so there was already hints that there was some sort of developmental experience that was necessary for those wood ducklings to acquire that ability to basically follow the maternal contact call. But that's also one of the reasons why he switched to mallard ducklings, because mallard ducks, if you raise them in an incubator, they still show this ability to imprint on the maternal contact call. So that's why he knew that there was a different type of experience between wood ducks and mallards. That with wood ducks, it was hearing your own wood ducks, it was hearing your neighbor's vocalization, but mallards, it was hearing their own vocalization. So yes, there is probably lots of deficits that could occur during early development that would prevent a wood duckling from doing this behavior. But I think the motivation behind Gilbert Gottlieb was to not identify deficits, but to identify regularly occurring experiences that play a specifically causal role. That if you don't have this experience, you're not going to have this behavior, but otherwise you'll be fine. So that was the motivation behind Gilbert's experiments.
Okay. Thomas, would you like to ask?
Yeah, so thank you for this fascinating talk. I'm a AI machine learning person, and so when I see these kind of dependencies that it seems that in some sense maybe arose accidentally, but they were reliable enough that evolution can rely on them to allow development to proceed. They seem like threats to reliability. If I were building designing an engineering system to have this changing interaction with the environment over time, I would, I don't know, I want to avoid the thing that I have to hear my neighboring chick, stimulate this. Although I love the mother giving me fluffing signs that I'm doing the right thing. So how do I turn this into a question? I guess don't some of these surprising environmental influences create vulnerabilities that might threaten the success of the species in the future?
Well, yes and no. I think if you go back to probably one of the beginnings of James Mark Baldwin, who proposed the Baldwin effect of evolutionary processes. He basically said that at the very forefront of evolution, where organisms are always currently, we're always presenting developmental novelties. There's noise in developmental systems that's generating new contingencies. And if a developmental system can utilize a predictable aspect of the environment, that means a part of the environment that is in many ways probably going to be even more predictable than the genetic sequences you inherit from your parents, which are stochastic. You've got linkage, disequilibrium, and stuff like that. So this idea that the environment is unreliable and a source of information, I don't think is really supported in developmental systems theory. And if you are evolutionarily able to use a reliable experience with your environment to get to a more adaptive endpoint, then that might generate vulnerabilities if that is taken away. But if it's a reliable enough aspect of the environment, I don't see it generating that much vulnerabilities in the system. So I think that when you think of evolution acting on these systems, you have to think of the whole developmental system as it goes and what they use. And for some species that may rely on, very specific experiences that are only present in specific habitats, yeah, maybe that is a vulnerability in terms of evolutionary. But you also get, species like rats, which, can use a lot of different contingencies and get to the same endpoint. Yeah, I think that answers your question.
Yeah, yes, and I'm reminded of this work of the Grants on genetic transfer in Darwin's finches, because some of the young boys learn the wrong song and then mate with a different species, and that outcrossing is very valuable for sustaining the diversity of the different species. So it can have that kind of a function too, I suppose, of enhancing reliability rather than damaging, threatening it. Thank you.
Richard?
Thanks, that was awesome. Really interesting. I wondered if you could comment on something which I'm struck by in the contrast between the way pathologists and comparative psychologists appear to think about innateness and the way I tend to, the way I think that developmentalists in sort of interested in infant and child cognitive development seem to do oftentimes. So often, much of the time, you were wondering whether a behavior was innate, and you were wondering whether or not the behavior was innate, and the evidence for showing that it wasn't was that it was manipulable under surprising environmental stimuli, right? So things that you might not initially suppose were relevant, turn out it is, that if you manipulate the environment in certain ways, you get certain outcomes. I'm struck by that seems to be a very different focus than cognitive scientists and developmental psychologists are often focused on, where they're rather less concerned with whether the behavior is innate, but rather whether or not some part of the system that's responsible for bringing about behavior under the appropriate circumstances is innate. So, I mean, just because it comes to mind and because it's sort of, you know, a classic example of an innateness hypothesis, Chomsky never said that linguistic behavior was innate, right? It was well known that there were lots of environmental perturbations that would inhibit or change and diminish or improve linguistic performance. The claim was that there were certain parts of the system that were relevant to exhibiting such behavior in reliable ways that were innate or not learned, or however we want to characterize it. So I wondered whether or not you had views about, if we switch from issues about behavior to issues about, as it were, the mechanism that's responsible for the etiology of that behavior, whether or not you have the same view, or whether or not you think that that makes a difference.
For me, no, I don't think it makes a difference. I include even morphological characteristics underneath this that we don't, that our bodies are not innate. They develop as well in response to experiences that are reliable. But I mean, in terms of Chomsky, you know, what he did is, I was actually, when I was doing my master's, I was sitting next to Johann Bolhaus's lab, and he was writing a paper with Chomsky at the time when I was doing my master's, and I heard a lot of their discussions on this, and it seemed how Chomsky views these sort of things is that there is some, you know, core attributes, whether you know, innate grammar or something, that are in some fashion have instantiated themselves within the human species over the course of evolution, and that may very well be good, but it is not a developmental hypothesis that just because something is predictable and is shared by all members of the species means that it has always been there and has always been the inevitable consequence of our developmental systems. And so how I would respond to those is that the same way that, you know, ethologists talked about behavior. So if you look at the classical example of egg rolling in geese, it used to be the case that that whole behavior was innate, according to Konrad Lorenz. But upon further analysis, it was found that a lot of it was really variable between individual to individual, and that only one of the movements, the sagittal movement, was considered innate. And then upon later looking at prenatally in the egg, it was found that that sagittal movement represented a transition between the egg environment, where the embryo's head was actually held in that position. So it had been making that specific movement for as long as it was an embryo. And so when you look at things from the prospective view, it doesn't matter how you carve up a trait, a cognitive ability or something, it has to come from somewhere. And that it's the nature of developmental systems not to be centralized. So we shouldn't see, for instance, something that looks like a program, because if you're relying on relationships between the organism, the gene, and outside, where is that program instantiated? It has to be instantiated somewhere outside of those relationships, outside of the organism environment, in order to encode that information. So that's pretty much my basic point. That whenever we make claims of innateness, is what are we making a developmental hypothesis, or are we just making it a little bit easier for us to understand?
I mean, sort of me and various other people have suggested all sort of different ways that it functions in different sciences. So, I mean, the interesting thing is, it strikes me that I agree with almost everything you said in that talk, apart from the bit where you said, and that means that we shouldn't think about this computationally. That sort of came out the blue somewhat, right? I was missing sort of multiple steps in that argument. But everything you said up to that point, it just struck me as exactly right and exactly what should be said, and my reading of the development of the ethological literature as well. Okay, thank you.
Iris?
Thanks for a great talk. So to follow that from a different direction, I think the point of contention here is is the focus on environmental input. I don't think that Chomsky or anybody else would dispute that universal grammar would require some triggering conditions. That you choose to say if there are triggering conditions, if the environment matters in any shape or form, then it ain't innate, whereas Chomsky would say, no, triggering conditions are not a psychological mechanism, and therefore this can still be innate. So I think it's a question of methodology and of research agenda. And the research agenda that you plot is, let's just look at the gene by environment interactions and let's not partition the variance into innate or not innate. I think that's what I'm hearing here. I'm wondering whether there's something lost here in translation, right? So from your perspective, would you lose anything because by following this approach, you cannot differentiate, say, between a trait such as having two hands and a trait like knowing French? Is it important for science to draw this distinction between those two traits?
So I don't know how much time I have left, Matt, but so one of the things you said there is you said, which you used a very interesting word, you used the word triggering. And triggering is one of the words that would trigger me, because triggering is assuming is that the organism has already some form of organization, and it already needs an experience to just kick that off. So the innate grammar is sitting in there and just waiting for a releaser to release it. And the qualities of that experience, what is triggering it, do not causally shape the underlying architecture of that system. And that's the distinction I'm making, is because it's not triggering, the experiences are constructing those differences. So an example I give is when a chick hatches from within the first few seconds, the first behavior she or she will usually do, is they'll pick at the ground. And for a long period of time, it was thought that pecking behavior and the experience of pecking was triggered a pecking response in the organism's brain. And the result of that was an innate module that they had in their brains that basically told them, you need to peck in order to get food, and that the experiences triggered that. But what's been shown in ethology is that actually the hunger mechanism that doesn't control pecking during early life. So that these early experiences, far from just triggering a mechanism, actually integrate and construct them. So pecking, the very first time you have it, integrates the hunger system, which is already present in the embryo, and the visual system that is necessary to find food. And that those things aren't latent. If they don't have that experience, they won't have that ability. So it's not in the system. The experience creates that system. And so that's the difference, I think, the main difference between people who talk about innate systems as being triggered versus me that talking about them being constructed by experience. And that's a slight difference, and I could debate about that a little bit longer. But what was your other question?
Yeah, I'm totally happy to grant the notion that the environment has a causal role and to, scratch triggering if you don't like it. I think you've demonstrated convincingly that the environment has a causal role. I think Chomsky would actually accept that as well. The question then is, if we then cancel innateness, if we say it's not a useful scientific concept, then you lose the ability to distinguish between traits such as having two hands and traits such as, learning French or having command of French. Is that, are we losing something important?
I personally, and I don't see that distinction. There's a lot of researchers within developmental psychobiology who study, who are able to study behaviors such as, able to distinguish learning French and handedness and stuff like that, and do it without assuming that they're innate. But I guess the question is going back to the original talk is, what do we mean when we're talking about innateness? Is innateness just a word that we're using to describe something that's typical of a species? In that case, if it's a descriptive term that just describes what a species typically has versus what is more variable in a species, I don't really see an issue with that. But the baggage with the word is that it is often used as an explanation for development, especially within scientists who don't know about the developmental history, but like in Tony Zader's paper, he calls behaviors innate because they occur early in life, they're predictable, and they don't seem to have a lot of opportunities for experience. But that's not empirically investigated. And so what I want to say is that claims of innateness may actually hinder developmental explanations by forming a sort of cognitive model, even unconsciously, for how these things evolve. Oh, well, they're fixed. They have to be responsible for the genes. They have to be responsible for the underlying biology. And even if we don't think that's damaging because it's kind of a shortcut, it still might cut off routes to some very interesting developmental questions in a wide range of species that I personally find very important. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much.